The devil you know, how the brain minimizes surprise. Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today we are going to completely shatter a deeply held myth about your mind and how it processes happiness. You know, we've all been taught that our brains are basically these reward-seeking engines, just constantly on the hunt for joy, comfort, and positive experiences. But what if that's entirely wrong? What if your brain is actually optimizing for something else entirely? Something that explains why getting exactly what you want can sometimes feel like literally the most terrifying thing in the world. Let's get right into it.
Why do we self-sabotage the moment things finally go right? It's a bizarre, but let's be honest, incredibly relatable mystery. Why can peace and positive change suddenly feel like an existential threat? You finally land that healthy relationship, or you get the big promotion, or maybe you just experience a quiet weekend without any crisis. By all logic of self-improvement, you should be feeling triumphant, right? But instead, you might feel this sudden urge to pick a fight, or this impending sense of doom, or a really bizarre suspicion that you're just faking it all. Why do we unconsciously sabotage our own growth the literal second we cross the threshold into a better life? Well, to understand this, we really have to look at the mechanics of the map your brain uses to navigate reality.
What we think the brain wants versus what it actually wants. We think our brain wants happiness, growth, and optimal living. But what it actually wants is predictability, minimizing surprise, and maintaining the map. The crucial point here is that your nervous system is actually a surprise prevention machine. Your brain holds what's called a generative model. It's basically an internal map of how the world works. If your map was drawn during a chaotic or traumatic past, well, it predicts danger, rejection, or instability. And when you encounter those negative things, your brain isn't exactly happy, but it is satisfied, because the map was right. But when you encounter safety and love, suddenly your map is wrong. Your nervous system vastly prefers a known hell over an unknown heaven, simply because the known hell is computationally safe.
All right, so this brings us to the free energy principle, which is the biological drive to minimize surprise by closing the gap between the brain's internal predictions and external reality. It's a fascinating concept from computational neurobiology. Basically, think of your brain as an inference engine that is trying desperately to avoid prediction errors. Free energy is just a fancy mathematical term for surprise, that gap between what you expect to happen and what actually happens. When that gap is large, your nervous system experiences a massive metabolic spike. To your brain, a large gap doesn't feel like, oh hey, I'm learning a new, better way to live. No, it feels like a literal existential threat. The fundamental objective of your entire organism is to maintain homeostasis by keeping this surprise as low as humanly possible.
Think about a traumatized nervous system prioritizing familiar harm over uncertain healing. A traumatized nervous system often gets trapped in a sort of loop. It's anchored to familiar, predictable pain. Now, when a person tries to move out of that loop toward healing, it's not some gentle, easy slope of relief. Instead, there's this jagged, violent spike of panic. That is the prediction error spike. It's literally the biological cost of updating a load-bearing survival model. Your brain registers the new, positive state not as a victory, but as a highly dangerous anomaly that needs to be corrected immediately.
Familiarity minimizes free energy, not valence. This is a somewhat uncomfortable truth. Valence just means whether an experience is objectively good or bad, and the thing is, the brain doesn't actually care if a state is joyful or miserable. It only cares that it's familiar. Why? Because these beliefs, these negative models of the world, they were earned under intense survival pressure. The brain assigned them what researchers call high-precision priors. They are locked in with absolute, rock-solid confidence because at one point, they kept you alive. Letting go of a negative self-model feels like risking death, because to a traumatized nervous system, misery and existence have basically become functionally the exact same thing.
We see a really visceral example of this from the source material. Shayna Lintner describes doing everything right, finally escaping a lifetime of turbulence and reaching a place of true stability. And the result? She said, I found myself panicking alone in a bathtub, trying to figure out how I could get back to hell. Her nervous system was treating the unfamiliar good of peace as a massive, completely destabilizing surprise. The sudden absence of chaos triggered a full-scale neurological mutiny. This perfectly captures that exact moment when the brain screams that the lack of familiar threat signals is, in itself, a mortal threat. So let's look at the learner's checklist for identifying model updating panic. You've got the fake feeling, the urge to sabotage, existential dread, and the bathtub effect. This bathtub effect is a prime example of the metabolic cost of updating your survival model, and it shows up in a few really specific ways. If you feel like a total fraud when things go well, or if you get this sudden, entirely irrational urge to pick a fight with a loving partner just to restore a familiar conflict, well, that's your brain engaging in active inference. It's acting on the world to force it to match your old negative map. The dread and the bathtub effect, they aren't signs that your new life is wrong. They are simply the internal noise of a map being rewritten.
Is your intellect a trap? How do high-functioning people navigate this terrifying process? If you're smart, your brain actually has an incredibly sophisticated trick up its sleeve to avoid this panic. We use complex philosophies, constant analysis, and intellectualization as an elaborate cognitive armor. When the raw, unscripted reality of healing gets a little too close for comfort, the brain realizes that actually feeling the emotion is a threat to the system's stability, so it pivots. It decides to think about the emotion instead.
Using our smarts to understand a wound can actually become a brilliant safety behavior. It completely substitutes cognitive mastery for actual, messy emotional processing. As the quote goes, beautiful sentences are what you reach for when a word is too heavy to pick up bare. You can achieve a state of total fluency about your own trauma. You can map it, you can explain it perfectly, you can even joke about it, while remaining completely behaviorally unchanged by it. It's a way of mapping the territory so thoroughly that you never actually have to step onto the ground and get your shoes dirty.
We can really contrast this by comparing two very different spaces, the library and the kitchen. The library is where we intellectualize pain, using abstraction and prose to stay perfectly safe inside our own heads. It's a very safe headspace. The kitchen, on the other hand, is the somatic, physical truth of the present moment. It's stubborn relational reality. It's unscripted intimacy. You see, when you're in the library, you're protected from prediction errors because you completely control the narrative. But true healing? That can only happen in the stubborn relational reality of the kitchen, where you actually have to let the other person surprise you.
And what's wild is that this biological drive for predictability doesn't just happen in our heads. It scales all the way up to an institutional level. Think about a carceral Ouroboros, an institutional loop where recidivism is basically the system's feedstock. Just as our nervous system defends a known trauma, the prison industrial complex defends its predictable extraction model. The system doesn't actually want to eliminate recidivism. It relies on people returning to prison as the feedstock that keeps the entire machine running. Efforts to genuinely reform individuals are structurally antagonistic to the machine's revenue. So, much like the traumatized brain, the institution fiercely defends the devil it knows to maintain internal stability, treating true progress as an absolute threat.
Healing requires tolerating the error of the unfamiliar good. Escaping this self-sabotage, whether we're talking on a personal or an institutional level, isn't about thinking your way out. You literally cannot analyze your way out of a loop because the analysis is often just the exact same loop operating at a higher altitude. Instead, healing requires enduring the uncomfortable prediction error of positive change without using intellectualization as an escape hatch. You have to sit in the unfamiliar good long enough for the brain to relearn that it is actually safe. You have to actively tolerate the error instead of resolving it the cheap way by running right back to the familiar pain.
So to actually put this into practice, there's a somatic experiment designed specifically to bypass the intellect. It's called the 90-minute kitchen protocol. It consists of 3 steps: the break, the task, and the witness. It is designed to force your prediction engine into a real-time violation of a familiar, painful script and to keep you totally out of the library while you do it. If talking about the pattern has basically become the pattern itself, this protocol cuts off that escape route. Let's look at how these 3 intense phases force your nervous system to stay in the present moment without the safety umbrella of your intellect.
Phase 1 is the break. You sit face-to-face with a trusted partner without performing a task, and you state a familiar, painful script, like, when you get close, I pull away and explain things. Then your partner deliberately breaks that relational script by just staying close and staying quiet. For 20 minutes, you track only body sensations. You let your nervous system feel the pattern break, reporting only present-tense physical sensations. Tight chest, heat in face. No explaining why, no narrative, storytelling, or explanation allowed. If you start to explain, you literally start over. You just sit in the raw, unbearable prediction error.
Then we move to phases 2 and 3, the task and the witness. You perform a shared physical task, like doing the dishes, and then conduct a constrained debrief. The constraints stay incredibly tight. You can only speak in present tense observations, saying things like, the water is hot, or you looked at the floor. Absolutely no concepts, frameworks, or trauma words are allowed. By the time you reach the end, you've asked the thinking mind to build absolutely nothing from the experience. You've left the discomfort totally uninterpreted and raw. You've taught your nervous system that it can experience the unfamiliar good, the unscripted presence of another person, without having to perform its competence just to survive.
Are you willing to tolerate the panic of an unknown heaven? I want to leave you with this provocative final thought. We spend so much of our lives trying to outsmart our pain, endlessly describing the rain while forgetting to actually feel the water. But as we've seen today, your brain will always fight to keep the familiar hell alive simply because it's predictable. To truly heal, will you drop the cognitive armor? Will you sit in the unfamiliar good, enduring the terrifying surprise of peace, long enough to let your survival map finally rewrite itself? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the map, and I'll see you next time.